It's June 4th. If you missed us last month, it was because we were very busy at the Build conference, which I'll talk to you a little about in a moment, but we're on to our normal regular first Tuesday of the month scheduled from here on out. The calls are available, as you probably are aware, because you're on this call at aka.ms/Microsoft Graph call. The next call will be on July 2nd, 2019, right before Americans start to celebrate Independence Day. So it'll be a nice short week with a good call in it. And we cover off all things to do with what's new in the Microsoft Graph. And we also get presenters from both Microsoft and also the community. So if you're a developer that's been working with the Microsoft Graph and you think you have something cool to show or some contributions you've made to open source, we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out to us after the call. Today's presentation, I'm going to give you a very quick update, essentially on where you can go to find out all that are definitely worth paying attention to, that are kind of broad across the whole graph as a Microsoft 365 developer. And then Daryl and Jason will actually be presenting today on their productivity apps. And we had a lot of requests to go a lot deeper than how deep we went at Build on specific demos and from what we showed at Build. And so I thought it'd be a great opportunity as Daryl and Jason had time to present that today. So just quickly on Microsoft Graph updates, if you go to graph.microsoft.com, nice easy URL to remember, you'll land on our homepage. And at the moment, we have a hero banner here for Build. And you can go watch both Satya's keynote and the technical keynote by Rajesh, who is our executive vice president here that owns all of Microsoft 365 and showcases a lot of cool things coming across the kind of the developer stack, but also Microsoft 365 in general, which is obviously inclusive now of Windows 10. And so those two keynotes are going to give you a good idea about what's going on. And then our team inside of Microsoft Graph had about 6 or 7 different sessions that covered different areas of the Microsoft Graph. And so in this Build post here, we have links directly to where the slides are and the videos are on demand for the various different sessions we have, including some of the interviews that Yuna and I and Daryl and I had around the Microsoft Graph. These are great ways to keep up to date with where we're going and what our vision is. And some of the things I want to call out is, as part of Rajesh's session, we actually showcased where our vision is with Microsoft Search from an extensibility perspective. So for those that are currently doing search scenarios using the SharePoint APIs directly on the SharePoint endpoint, we are looking very, very shortly to release a beta of the Microsoft Search APIs on the Microsoft Graph. This will allow you to not only search things like files across both OneDrive and SharePoint, but also return results from your mail, calendar, and in the second wave of release, your Teams conversations and planner tasks and so forth. And so this Microsoft Search is truly going to be a Microsoft-wide search across M365, rather than kind of more traditionally where you would use the SharePoint Search APIs to get at files, and then you would go talk to the mail endpoint and do OData query filters to search across your own individual mailbox. And so I'm really excited to see from a developer perspective what you do there. And we have scheduled up, as soon as that reaches beta, for the team to come on from the Microsoft Search API team to talk and showcase this. And because we don't have conferences until a while, this will be the place that we actually launch those APIs. So that's going to be great from that perspective. So I highly recommend watching such as Vision Keynote for direction of Microsoft and Rajesh's technical keynote, because it covers at a very broad level all the new things that we're working on inside of Microsoft 365. And then Yina has the session with Mark Stafford here, which was already a high-level overview. But we went a bit different this year and drove into 4 different breakouts, which have focused on kind of the app-only side of the Microsoft Graph. And there is still someone smashing the keyboard. If they could turn themselves on mute, that'd be awesome. Or if Danny, you can nix him in the background. Thank you. And we also had some specifically on things like the best way to write code around background processes that you're running maybe in Azure Functions or in long-running processes inside of Azure App Service or some other means, containers. And then specifically, because we did a general availability of Data Connect, we had a session on how you can build insight applications using Data Connect and things like the Security Graph APIs. So some great content here that's all free that's available. And this is definitely the best place to get to it from the Graph homepage on this new build banner splash that we have. And then one other big call out from what we showed at the conference and to map to what Daryl had showed around the SDKs is now we have inside of the various different commands, and I think Daryl's actually going to show this, so maybe I'll just briefly cover this, is that where we have the examples of how you call to get messages within the Graph API and see what that response might look like, we also now have these code snippets. And so if you're already using the SDKs or you thought about exploring the SDKs and maybe sometimes you get kind of tripped on, hang on, what does that syntax look like inside of my code? You can now go through for right now C# and JavaScript and go through and actually copy the code directly and paste that into your environment. And so there's some really neat things we've added as part of the developer experience at Build, which you should really go check out. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Daryl and Jason to talk about the productivity apps demos they did at Build and just see a different flavor of what they showed in that Build session. So Daryl, Jason, thanks for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Hey, Jeremy.
So we'll keep you off mute, but I will continue to guard the mute button from anyone else that joins late to the call. But Daryl and Jason and I work very closely together on Microsoft Graph, and they did an awesome session at Build, and we did get a lot of requests based on Twitter noise and people talking about it when they went back to their workplaces that we wanted to see more of it. So without that further ado, I'll just take it away, Daryl and Jason.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. This is our delightfully descriptive title that we had for our session. Let's move right in so that we have some extra time to discuss about the demos that we are doing. As a very high level, we're going to show 3 demos. One is a mobile device application. The other is a web application using ASP.NET, and the other is showing integrated experience application. And we'll explain what we mean by that as we go along. And for each of the demos, what we're going to do, we'll just introduce the scenario, kind of tell you the problems that we're trying to solve. Jason's going to demo the application and dig into the code, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion around the code. And then I'll quickly go over some of the design choices and maybe dig in a little bit deeper than I did at Build, although you can always watch that video if you want to go back to those items. So without further ado, just if you haven't seen any of these sessions, they're all themed around this Contoso Airlines idea. So this medium-sized business, it's a small airline, has a bunch of developers, they're mostly web and mobile, and they're using the Office, Microsoft Graph with their M365 E5 subscription. So we should get started with the mobile device application. And we had a minor challenge in the fact that normally we will be able to actually plug the mobile device in, but in this case we can't plug in the mobile device to share because Teams doesn't let you do that yet. So we have just slides for the actual demo. And before we go into that, I'm just going to skip over a few slides here because I very cleverly inserted them into the wrong place in the deck. So just to introduce this idea is mobile applications are about reaching employees in the field. It's about putting information at their fingertips so that they can be more productive and have the information that they need so they're happier employees. But there are issues to consider when building mobile apps, and there are reliability issues because you're often dealing with low bandwidth situations, low reliability networks, or if you happen to be 35,000 feet in the air, you may have no connectivity whatsoever. So what do you do when you've no connectivity? How do you make your app still useful? Well, you bring data offline. The challenge, of course, is once you've brought data offline, you have personal and valuable data that is potentially losable. If somebody loses a phone, you don't want that information to be potentially accessible by somebody else. So actually, if you go back to the Ignite demo last year, Jeremy and Yina demoed using the Microsoft Graph to remotely reset a device. So we have capabilities in the graph to really help you manage that, to be able to make sure that that offline data is still secure. The other thing that's kind of unique about the mobile platform is you are going to have users who want to work with different platforms. Everybody doesn't necessarily want to be given some stock standard company phone. They want to be able to bring their own device. So you need to support cross-platform, iOS, Android, and maybe even those pure few diehard Windows Phone users are still out there. So we have that support for cross-platform capabilities. And it's not just about being able to retrieve data onto the phone. You also want to be able to reach your employees out in the field and provide them with notifications in order for them to be updated when things may change in the field. So enough talking from me. Let's hand it over to Jason and let's see the mobile app demo and some of the code that goes into that.
Thanks, Daryl. Okay, I'm going to take over the screen here. So like Daryl said, unfortunately, I don't have a live demo of this iOS app, but we will kind of show it off a little bit in some beautiful slides. So the first screen that we're seeing here is one of our flight attendants at Kotoso Airlines logged into the application. And this is just the home view in the app, and it's designed to be sort of a at a glance, quick look at his next upcoming flight and what he's got coming up after that. So all this data is coming from Microsoft Graph, including his picture and name at the top, the flight data coming from his calendar, profile photos of the rest of the crew for that flight coming from the Graph users API, and then his upcoming flights also coming from his calendar. Now, he can tap on any of these flights, either the next flight or the upcoming flight, and get a little more detail on the rest of the crew and have the ability to quickly contact them. So again, we're showing the information about the flight, including the departure gate, which is data that we're pulling from an open extension on the event in the user's calendar. And then we're also going and getting profile information for each of the crew, including their title, so we know if they're a pilot or a flight attendant, and their mobile number so that we can message them or give them a call. So just by tapping on one of the related icons there, we can just tap right into the native iOS functionality to make a call to that number. But then the other side of this application, and one of the main reasons that Kotoso would want their flight crew to have this application installed on their phone is for when last minute changes happen, so that they can get notified quickly and they're not wasting a lot of time running around the airport. So when things happen and a flight gets moved to a different gate or the departure time gets pushed back, the crew needs to know about that as quickly as possible. And the app uses Graph notifications to achieve that. So whenever a flight gets updated by an administrator in the master flight list, then it goes out and it uses Microsoft Graph to post these notifications to each of the members of the crew. And they get a notification, a native iOS notification right on their device, letting them know this. So let's get out of this and take a look at some of the code that's making this stuff happen. So first, I've got all of the graph-related operations in this graph manager class. Just makes it easier for us to sort of take a look at what's going on. So first, I just want to point out how we set up the Graph SDK. So we have a Graph SDK for Objective-C, which of course is also usable in Swift. And the way that you set that up is that you create an auth provider, this MSAL authentication provider, which is provided by the Graph SDK, but uses the MSAL for Objective-C library as a dependency. And here we're passing a MSAL public client application class that we've already created to do the initial login to the application. And then we're also telling it the permission skips that we need, like user.readbasic.all and calendar.read, that sort of thing. And then this is the actual client object that we use to make all our graph calls. So we're just using this ms client factory.create HTTP client and passing the auth provider. And by doing that, the SDK is going to handle all of our authentication for us. We just have to use that client to make all our graph calls. So let's look at a simple example of sort of the calling pattern for that SDK. And this is just the get me function. So this is making a call out to the /me endpoint on the graph. And you see that basically the pattern that you'll see repeated across all the functions in this class is that you create a request, giving it a URL. And the SDK provides us with a constant MS graph base URL, which is the v1 graph URL. And then we just add on the endpoint that we want to call, in this case, /me. Then we create the MS URL session data task, which is going to do the work of actually making that request happen, sending it across, and pulling back the response. So we create that, and in the completion block, we can check that data, check if there's an error. And then here we're going to do, we're going to cast the data that comes back to the MS Graph user. Now, MS Graph user is a type that's provided by a separate library from the actual SDK, which is this MS Graph client models, if you can see that at the top here. Now, this is an optional thing, so if you prefer to work with the data that comes back, the raw JSON data, you can do that. But if you are much happier using strongly typed objects, you can do that as well. And in this case, that's what we do. We cast it into a user and return it. Okay, so just a few other interesting bits of code in this particular demo. This is the get calendar view function. This is what we use to build out that home screen and get all of the users' upcoming flights. And we're doing quite a bit of things here to the request. So we're starting off with the /me/calendar view endpoint. That has a couple of required parameters, which is the start date time and the end date time, which basically is giving us a window of time that we want to view of the calendar. So we build that out, and then we're using a select statement here to limit the data that comes back. And as Daryl had mentioned, there's a number of considerations that you need to take into account when you're building mobile apps, and one of those can be the size of data transfer in and out on low bandwidth networks or people that have maybe limited data plans. So by using the select statement, we can specify we just want these few small fields back and nothing else, and that helps in that regard. So our app is only using subject location start and end on the actual event. Next, we're doing a filter. And on this filter, we're actually saying that we only want appointments that have a category set on them of signed flight. And that helps us just get the events on the calendar that we care about, and not any other extraneous events like dentist appointments and team meetings and things like that. The next thing we're doing is actually going to increase the size of our response by a little bit, but it's going to save us having to make separate responses down the line, which is the expand method. And we're expanding extensions, which are the open extensions that I referred to briefly before, that include information that's not really standard on an event, but is more relevant to our application. In this case, it has the user IDs of the rest of the crew, as well as the departure gate. So we're expanding the com.contoso.flight data extension. So that'll be included in the response that comes back. And then finally, we're just sorting them on the server by the start date time. So we get the next upcoming one first in the list, and then everything else is sorted for us.
Before we go on, I have a couple of things to mention. One is I posted in the chat that for people should post questions, but it looks like we're having some kind of infrastructure problems and messages are not coming through in the chat. So we're going to have to just make up our own questions here. So there's a couple of things that I just want to highlight going through. Just if you just scroll back up to the auth providers.
Yes.
When we set up the auth provider here, this is using kind of the interactive flow, where it will then use the native iOS kind of sign-in mechanism. That's what happens there, right?
Yeah. So basically, it launches Safari WebView to go out to login.microsoftonline.com and let the user do their login there and get presented with the list of scopes that the application wants, so that they can consent, and then it returns flow back to the application.
Yeah, and the other thing is we're passing a set of scopes here, and you kind of have two options. You can either set the initial set of scopes here, or you can do it in the registration portal as you would have to do in an app-only type environment. I think the recommendation is to do it directly in the application here, so you can see exactly in your source which what are the default scopes being selected by that application. And Vincent just came up with the brilliant idea of using Twitter to ask questions with the hashtag MSGraphCall. So if people want to ask questions, we will be monitoring that hashtag. We always have redundancy and failover in mind. The other thing that was worth mentioning, you called out the fact that we have the distinct models library, or what we also refer to as a service library, and we're doing that across all of the different languages. So no matter what, no matter which language you're using now, you should be able to either get access to just the models or just the core, or if you want to use both, use both. And finally, because there's so much to say about this wonderful little demo, you did a call to /me in your call. And we have two styles of APIs at the moment. We have ones that we're calling fluent APIs or fluent request builders, like we do in C# and Java, where you can actually dot your way through a strongly typed model to construct the request. Or you can do, we have what we call templated, which is the way Objective-C in JavaScript works, where you just enter the string as a path. Now, we have a request on our user voice from folks who would love to see that Fluent API also in JavaScript. So if you are also interested in having that Fluent API in JavaScript, please go to our Microsoft Graph user voice and upvote that. And if you think it would be valuable in Objective-C also, create a new user voice suggestion. And we will consider that when we're doing our next semester planning.
I think I just wanted to add as well, sorry, Daryl, that the open extension thing is an unsung hero that enterprise devs really give us great feedback on if they have dug in and used it. And I think I just wanted to call out, Jason, if you show that bit of code quickly, that where you can store things or retrieve things like the Contoso flight information, the flight data, in our docs at graph.microsoft.com, we have a whole section that shows you how you can add additional data into existing resource objects like an event. The benefit of this is that as a developer, I don't have to go have a separate database somewhere that stores maybe the flight number and other information about that flight separately, and then key it with a foreign key back to the event ID that's inside of the customer's event calendar. You can just key the data directly into the event inside of Microsoft 365 for free as part of the experience there with that extension. And so we see a lot of customers using this to kind of save having that additional architectural kind of place with a database to get that done. So if you haven't checked out extensions, I'd highly recommend taking a look at that in our documentation and obviously digging into some of these code samples that Jason's done, which really do showcase how these are so valuable.
And if you're using .NET or Java, those extensions will come back in the dictionary called additional data, which is attached to entities. Whereas if you're in more dynamic languages like Objective-C or JavaScript, well, JavaScript, it just adds a property to the object because JavaScript is magic. And Objective-C just treats all objects as dictionaries. So you can add new properties to those dictionaries. So we have a fairly consistent and hopefully natural way of accessing them based on whatever language you're using.
Good points. And thanks, Jeremy, for mentioning the code samples. I take this opportunity just very quickly to say that this demo and all of the Contoso related demos are on our GitHub page, github.com/Microsoft Graph. If you search for Contoso, these repositories are those Contoso related samples. And the iOS Swift sample is what we're looking at right now. So one other thing that I did want to show in the Swift demo is how we treat the profile photos. So in this case, we implemented a custom caching mechanism so that once we get a user's photo, we're caching it on the device and saving us from having to go out to the graph and ask for that photo every time we need to render it. We also tried to be a little clever here by requesting those photos using a batch request. So typical flight crew would be about 5 people for Contoso. So we could be making individual single requests for each user's photo. But in this case, we chose to just batch all those requests up and make a single request. And that's really in line with Apple's guidance on making one large request rather than multiple smaller requests. And it saves us having to manage all of these separate concurrent requests. So just looking at our, yeah, go ahead, Daryl.
The really interesting conversation there, and I'd love to be able to get more data from more people, is I reached out to try and find out more about where this guidance comes from with regards to large requests versus small requests. And I got some feedback from a person who used to work for Spotify. and they did research where they found that small requests from mobile devices were actually more reliable or more effective, should I say, because if something failed, then they only needed to retry a small request, right? So, because the thing is, if you have a large request and it fails, then you've got to redo that large request. And this was experience based on making Spotify work reliably in India, which has spotty network coverage. Some places it's really great, some places it's not. So it's something that we really need to dig into more and provide options so that people can do things different ways. But it always comes down to you need to try it and test it and see what works best for your particular scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. So just very quickly here, we can take a look at this.
Set a timer for 10 minutes.
Someone's off mute there.
At least we know that they're a Microsoft fan. They're using Cortana to set timers.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, just very quickly, we'll look at this and then we can sort of move on to the next demo. This get users photos method here. So first, we get in an array of user IDs to load the photos for, and we're going to go through and check our cache, which again, these are just saved directly as PNG files into the apps data folder on the device. So anything that matches, we're going to just go ahead and use that photo. So we're inserting it into our return array in the proper place there. And anything that we don't have, we're adding to a photos to fetch array right here. Okay, my screen decided to flicker on me there. Okay. So then if there are any to fetch, then we're going to go ahead and build the batch request. So we create an array of those IDs, and we call over to our graph manager's get users photo batch method. And if we want to take a quick look at that. So if there ends up only being one user ID in there, then we don't bother with doing the batch. We just go ahead and make a single call like normal. But if there is a request, more than one, then we do ahead create the batch request, which the first step is you create an array of these batch request steps. So a batch request is made up of multiple requests, and each one is modeled as a request step. And then we're just going to loop through here and build those requests. And we start off just like we did with getting me by creating the NS mutable URL request. And then we create the batch request step that takes that request as a parameter. Okay. Then once we've got all those done, we'll create the MS batch request content class, passing it that array of batch steps, and then we post that. So we create a final NS mutable URL request. This one's a post, and we give it the batch request data here in the body. And then we send it across. And once that comes back, then we can unwrap that as an MS batch response content, which will give us access to those arrays. And then we can loop through and get each one of the results.
And you will find classes that look exactly the same in .NET, Java, JavaScript as well. They're all named in a consistent way and should work in a completely consistent way.
Yep, and we'll see C# in the next demo, so we can compare and contrast. All right, with that, I'll turn it back to you, Darryl.
Excellent. So the thing is, we touched on some of the decisions that needed to be made going through that application, and there's lots of decisions, there's lots of trade-offs that need to be made, and we covered a bunch of them, so it'll allow us to go through this next set of kind of choices that were made fairly quickly, because we did cover some. But one of the key things when building mobile applications is, one of the most common questions we get is, well, okay, well, if I'm building a mobile app, should I call the graph directly, or should I build some kind of intermediate API and call that API and then call the graph? And there's a set of trade-offs. If you call the graph directly, you have the benefits of the graph itself and its scale. We are geolocated throughout the world. You're never going to have to worry about, well, do we need to scale up the graph? Because it already is scaled up. So that is a major advantage as far as not having to deploy that infrastructure. But there are limitations that come along with it, is that you can only do delegated access. You can only your application can only access the information that your end user who signed in is allowed to access. Whereas if you go via an API, you have the opportunity to do both delegated access using an on behalf of flow, or you could do app only access. So you can have secret credentials that are stored in the middle tier in order to access other information on behalf of, or sorry, using the credentials of the actual application, information that the user themselves can't necessarily get access to. And it also gives you that middle layer in order to compose responses and transform responses and things like that. Jason mentioned about retrieving a bunch of data and keeping information in sync, and this is important when you're trying to do things that are offline. And we have this mechanism called Delta queries, which are designed specifically for helping you sync data between some backend service and front end. And Delta syncs make a ton of sense in many cases, but there are some limitations of Delta queries that you need to be aware of. In Jason's demo, he was talking about having a scheduling window of 30 days to look at the calendar. And the problem is where each day that window kind of shifts and changes. So Delta queries, the Delta token that you would use to get that data, would no longer work on the next day. There's also things like retrieving the open type extensions. They needed to be retrieved using expand. And you can't do an expand with Delta queries. So for Jason's particular case, using filtered polling and being able to select and filter and limit the size of the response and then just poll on that actually turned out to be the better option. Sometimes what is initially the best option isn't necessarily the right thing to do. It's a case of you need to do performance testing and see what's the right thing for the right scenario. We also talked a little bit about SDKs, and it's quite a divisive conversation with SDKs. Some people love them, some people hate them, and nothing stops you from going out and just using the native libraries and making the calls yourself. There's also nothing stops you from using our full SDK. When people are building mobile apps, they do tend to get a little sensitive about the size of the library, and so we are working to try and minimize those. But if you really are concerned about pulling down the full size of our SDK, then we have kind of this hybrid option where you can use just the core SDK and you can just create your own models for just the parts of the graph that you are particularly calling. So the idea being that we want people to have the flexibility to use the SDKs in the way that makes the most sense for them. And this splitting of service libraries versus core seems to be our most effective way of doing that. We also, with regards to syncing offline data, yes, you can use Delta Sync, and Delta Sync works for certain simple scenarios in order to get the data backwards and forwards. We also saw the code that Jason wrote in order to do his own app caching of the profile photos. And if you're paying quite close attention, there was actually quite a lot of steps there insofar as you have to go and retrieve it, identify the photo, store that photo away, and then be able to, when you're going and getting a new photo, he had to go check to see, well, is the photo already there or not? Yes, it is. No, it's not, and so on and so forth. And that's only for doing caching with regards to just photos. What happens if we want to cache all other stuff? One of the other areas that we are exploring is the notion of being able to rely on HTTP caching, because HTTP itself defines a set of rules for how responses from a server could be cached. And there's a set of headers that allow you to determine how long something should be cached for, and a whole bunch of rules that allow generic code to be written. And there are caching libraries available for in Java and in .NET that you can just plug directly into the native libraries and take advantage of that. And that saves a whole lot of work. And we're looking into how to do a decent job of actually integrating those directly into our SDKs. And the last point that I just want to address is Jason brought up the idea of using batch requests so that you can make a set of requests all at once. There is another option that sometimes might make more sense, and that is that the challenge with batch requests is if you were making a set of requests and maybe one of those takes quite a bit longer than the other requests take to make, you have to wait for the long one to finish before you get any of the results back. So sometimes it actually makes more sense to make all of the requests independently as separate HTTP requests, even though there's a little bit of redundancy there insofar as sending an additional set of headers and potentially opening a new connection. The benefits come back in the fact that you could get those quick running requests back immediately and actually start processing them, rendering some UI, whilst you're still waiting for that long running one to complete. So there are different options for different scenarios, and Jason, I believe, has a demo later on that shows where it makes sense to make parallel requests instead of batch requests. Which brings us on to our next demo, which is web and desktop applications. And just to provide a little bit of context, here we're talking about, this is a demo about providing really rich interactive experiences, and it's about how to access data that is not necessarily my data, but it is data that belongs to other users. So in this case, we have the flight manager who's needs access to crew and assignment data, or flight and assignment data for the entire crew. And this needs to be controlled by a security group to allow that flight manager access to other people's data. I really don't need to say a whole lot more about this. It kind of explains itself. And at this point, I will let Jason take it away with the demo of our ASP.NET MVC Core application.
Thanks, Daryl. So what Daryl said, exactly. The point of this application is really to make sure that we have enough flight attendants on every flight to meet with Contoso's policy. So just a brief explanation of that is Contoso requires that there's a minimum of 2 flight attendants on every flight. But ideally, they would have 3. 3 flight attendants is considered a full contingent of flight attendants. So with that in mind, sort of explain the color scheme that we see here of these flight tiles. Green, obviously that means we're in a good state. We have a full crew. Yellow, we meet the minimum, so we have 2, but we have room for improvement. And then red, obviously we have not met the minimum. We have either 0 or 1. So right now I'm logged in as Megan, and Megan is one of our flight administrators. So she has this particular flight manager view, which allows her to edit all flights and see other folks' schedules. Once I'm done showing this experience, then we'll take a look at an individual flight attendant's experience in the same application. So let's take a look at one of these flights that aren't green, flight 902. And if we tap on this, then we load in some extra information. So across the top here, we have the currently assigned flight attendants. So we have Adil and we have Grady. And this UI that we're seeing here is actually part of the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which was announced at Build. This gives us some components that are sort of pre-built for us that use the Microsoft Graph, which saves us some time in coding these UI components. Then below this, we get sort of a mapping of availability of all flight attendants. So again, this is all coming from Microsoft Graph, and this is using one of our newer APIs on the Graph called getSchedule. This allows us to give an array of users and a window of time and get back their free busy information, which if you've used Outlook and the scheduling assistant, it's a similar sort of experience here. So we can take a look here, and just looking at our green outlined box telling us the duration of the flight, we can kind of quickly see which flight attendants are available to fill that last spot. And if we select one, then we get them added, save the flight, and that should turn to green, and it does. Okay, great. So now let's flip over and take a look at the flight attendant experience. So I've got this. I'm already signed in as Alex, our flight attendant. I'm just going to refresh this view since I just updated Flight 902. Okay, so we see that Flight 902 has disappeared since it's no longer available, and Alex isn't assigned to it. So a little explanation of this UI. Again, we use the same color code for the current size of the flight attendant assignments, but we have two different groups of flights here. So the first is upcoming flights, and these are the flights that Alex is already assigned to. And this data, just like in the mobile application, is coming from Alex's calendar. The second group are available flights, and these are any flights that are out there that Alex isn't already assigned to and that have open spots. So right now we just have the one. So if we tap on that, we get this little fly out to the side. It gives us a little information so we can see the current assigned crew. So in case there's any other flight attendants that Alex doesn't enjoy working with, he might decide not to sign up. And then he can see his calendar for that day to decide if there are any conflicts that maybe would make it not a good idea for him to volunteer for this flight. So scrolling through, we can see that he does have a dentist appointment fairly close to the scheduled departure time, so it's probably not a good idea for him to sign up for this particular flight. So let's take a look at some of the code that makes all that stuff happen. So this is an ASP.NET Core, but it's using a React front end. So this project was created using the .NET client, using the .NET new React template. So that basically builds your front end as a React application, and then it also includes a ASP.NET Web API backend for you. So that's sort of the architecture of this particular application. And first, let's take a look at some of the stuff in the front end. I mentioned that we're using the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, and that's here's one example of this MGT person component. So all of the Graph Toolkit's components will be prefixed with MGT, and it's interesting to point out that the Graph Toolkit is not a React library. It's agnostic. So it is a JavaScript library, but you can use it in Angular, you can use it in plain old JavaScript, you can use it in React, you can use it whatever new and upcoming frameworks come out in the future as well. But I just want to point out how easy it is to actually drop some of these components into your project. So in this case, all I've got to do without writing any code is give it the person query attribute and give it a user ID. In this case, the user ID is actually a little misleading. They actually want the email address of the user. And then I can control how that component renders. So if I don't want to show the email, I can remove this show email attribute. If I don't want to show the name, et cetera, et cetera. So I have some control over how that renders. So then let's take a look at the backend component, and we can see some of the Fluent API alternative SDK methodology that Daryl was talking about. So all of our graph functionality, with the exception of any graph calls that the graph toolkit is making, are all done through the backend components. So we do that by using what's called the on behalf of flow for authentication. So when the user signs into our application in the React front end, they're getting a token that gives them permission to call our backend API. By using that token, they make calls to our API. The API uses that token to exchange for a graph token to make calls on behalf of the user. And I just want to kind of show you how we set that up. So here, skip that one for now. We'll come back and I'll explain that in just a second. But here we're creating our on behalf of client. So we'll create our client credential using our app secret. And then we're using the Graph SDK's builders to build an auth provider for the on behalf of provider. All right, so we call this create client application. We're giving it our configuration information, app ID, redirect URL, our app secret, and our tenant ID. And we take that client and we create a new on behalf of provider object, giving it the client.
And just a little heads up to folks. We have that static factory method there currently in our authorization providers, but the providers are still in preview, and in some of the more recent versions of MSAL, they have a very nice Fluent API for creating the client applications. So we'll probably deprecate these factory methods because it's really easy to just create the client applications directly from MSAL now. So you will see that documentation and that new way of doing things coming to our docs fairly soon.
Great, that's great, Daryl. So I think what you're saying is that the change here would be that this code would go away and be replaced with the MSAL's builder.
Yes.
But the rest of this code would remain the same.
Exactly. There's no need for two different teams to write code that does effectively the same thing.
Yep.
We should have one solution for everywhere.
Ah, good point. Good point. Okay, so when we create that provider, then we can create the graph service client and pass it that provider. And at that point, just like in the Objective-C scenario, all of our authentication stuff is handled for us by the SDK, so we don't have to worry about doing any of the auth exchanges or any of that moving forward. So that's great. Now you'll notice here that I'm also creating a second graph client to do app-only calls. So part of the operations that our application backend needs need app-only permissions. And this is because we're doing some things that sometimes the logged in user doesn't have direct permission to. For example, flight attendants don't have direct access to the SharePoint list that is the master flight list. So in order to retrieve those available flights that we saw in Alex's view from SharePoint, we need to not rely on his credentials, and we do that by using app only. So let's look at some of the more interesting things that happen with Graph in our backend. And I mentioned that our availability map is built using the Get Schedules API. And I'm seeing that we're getting really close to time here, so I'm going to try to be really quick so we can wrap up. So here we're calling the Get Schedules. We start by creating our start and end time of the window that we want to see, very similar to Get Calendar View. And we're querying the Azure Active Directory to get all the group members of our flight attendant security group so that we can get all of their user emails. Once we have that array of emails, then we can make the actual graph call here. And this is what Daryl was referring to with the Fluent API to build the requests. So we're actually just going user client .me.calendar. So instead of building a string that is /me/calendar, we're just using the API to sort of build that for us. Then we call it the get schedule, and we pass the parameters, the array of emails that we want to get availability for, the start and end time. Then we build the request. And here, this is the other key piece of the on behalf of flow, the with user assertion method in this chain inserts that token from the user that came from our front end, and that allows the Graph Service Client to handle all of that token exchange for us with the on behalf of flow. And then we're posting. So this is a post and not a get, and we get back that array of availability. So with that, we're close to time. I'm going to just go ahead and cut it short and turn it back to Daryl.
Okay, excellent. Let's I'm going to take us right to our wrap-up slide and suggest that if you want to see all the excitement in the last demo, the video that we did at Build is available. I think it was in the links at the beginning, but it's BRK 3082. What we are really asking you to do is to partner with us for productivity and leverage the Microsoft Graph to access user data, extend it using open types, open schema types, and understand about all the different issues with regards to data access control, app only, and delegated access. And measure, because you want to make sure your app is working appropriately for your scenarios. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jeremy, who just stole my screen from me anyway. So Jeremy, take it away.
I will say, like, the fact I asked you guys to go deep into the demos was exactly what you did. So the fact you didn't get to that third one, it probably makes sense because, you know, I think the level of the coding that you showed there and the tips will be super valuable to people as well. So thanks, Jason, for showing the code, and Daryl for showing all the tips and suggestions there as well. Just a few things to wrap up. If you weren't at Build or the SharePoint conference, we have introduced a Microsoft Graph mascot. You would see on Twitter, there's a few conferences going on, like the Dev Insiders Tour right now. If you go to Dev Insider Tour hashtag on Twitter, there's a whole series of events globally that are showing about Microsoft 365 development. It's a free event you can sign up for. They're currently in South Africa, for instance. So depending on where you are in the world, I'd definitely go and check and see if you can get to one of those one-day events. But I get a lot of asks around how do we get the giraffe stickers. We have open sourced the giraffe in various different image formats, and you can use trusted sticker providers to get these things printed as these hexagon shapes. So if you haven't already done that, or you're looking for an event that you're running coming up, that's definitely the best way to get access to those stickers, and it saves me licking stamps and sending them all off as well. So outsourcing that approach. And then we've got some great shows coming up on the Dev podcast from the SharePoint conference and Build. So if you're not already listening to the podcast on your commutes, I'd highly recommend the M365 Dev podcast that I do with Paul Schaeflein, who's an MVP based out of Chicago. We've just recently done some on the SDK updates that Darren and I went into a lot of detail around, as well as kind of just in general what we thought of the Rajesh's keynote. where I kind of had my own commentary and opinions on those things. So definitely check that podcast out. And then just as a quick reminder, July 2nd, at the same time, 8 a.m. PDT, we will be doing our July community call. I am still looking for a community speaker. I'd love to have someone on. You don't have to be an MVP to be able to present. Any developer can present on here, and we'd love to see what you're working on and what tips and tricks you've got. We will also looking for more contributions on various different open source projects we've got too. So if you're looking for a pet project over the summer or the winter, depending on wherever you are in the world at the moment, please reach out to Daryl and Jason. We have some bounties we have on various different open source projects that if you feel like you want a challenge and you want something out of your normal work week to contribute to an open source project, we've got a bunch of things that we'd love to get more engagement with the community on. So again, big thank you to Jason and Daryl for kind of going deeper on their build session there and showing off that code. Keep an eye on the blog post for this on graph.microsoft.com. It'll be on the homepage where you'll be able to get this on demand, and we'll also provide all the links to the slide decks and the recordings and the source code and so forth, so they'll be able to kind of jump in, have a look at all that code that Jason and Daryl have shown today. So we look forward to seeing you on July, but please keep tapped in via Twitter with all our Twitter handles. And if you have any questions after the fact, definitely just reach out to us on Twitter. We're all very responsive there. And enjoy the rest of your days.